Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm joined again tonight by John Mykytyshyn, who is a political consultant. He's a public opinion researcher. He's a conservative activist, and he's a really smart guy. He's well tuned into what's going on. And I thought I'd check in with him. Thanksgiving is over. We had a lot of time around the family turkey tables, the dinner tables. We probably talked politics, housing affordability, inflation, what's going on in Israel, et cetera. And so I thought it'd be good to check in with John as to what he thinks is going to happen. John, let's start, if we could, with Premier Doug Ford. Do you think he can survive? Can he come back from this the Greenbelt land swap debacle?
Absolutely. The reality is there's so much time between now and the next provincial election that there's time for many, many more crises between now and then.
So no problems, he can come back. Was the apology the right thing?
That's I'll leave that for policy wanks to figure out. There's a question of, I think he was absolutely right on the process. One of the problems with anybody who gets elected premier is that they've never done it before. There's no experience. There may have been some people who've had the job before you that you can turn to for advice, but it comes down to a very, very much an individual hallmark of how you personally want to do business. And for that, the reality is it depends upon the maddening crowd, right? Whether or not, with every action you take, with every decision you take, are you a great person or a terrible person in their minds purely because it's decided upon whether or not you agree with that person. And that's the conundrum, right? So Greenbelt, great thing. Taking things out, putting other things in. Really, all the condemnation was really about the process. So if there had been a better, more reasoned process, then the premier would have never had any kind of scandal, whatever. He still would have had, just to be fair, a chorus of haters that would have been against anything he did with the Greenbelt, but at least you wouldn't have had an integrity commissioner coming out saying, what kind of process was that? Not anything we've seen in government before.
Well, the process certainly did seem, if not corrupt, close to it, with cash paid for hotel bills and massages at the same time and stuff like that.
It is absolutely, look, there's a long way between the appearance of corruption and actual corruption. And let's be fair again, that 90% of people think that all politicians are corrupt and nothing could be further from the truth. But the problem is you need to live your life as an elected official and a staffer for elected officials in such a way that is above reproach. So that when you give people things to talk about, it's more than reasonable to think they're going to talk about them. And while there's been no charges, there's been no allegations, I certainly think that in addition to the haters, those people who will always be anti-Ford no matter what, that there's now a significant number of people on top of that in the population that believe there was wrongdoing of some type. And that's just not helpful if you want to govern a province.
But you think he can come back from all this? He's got enough time. There's enough time to the next election.
He's got enough time to come out with great policy and get the province completely behind him. And he's got enough time to have 3 or 4 major disasters.
3 or 4 more disasters.
Well, look, I live in Hamilton, and my pet peeve is the LRT, right? So 5 years ago, we had an election which was dominated by the LRT, and they haven't broken ground. They haven't laid a rail. They have evicted a whole lot of people from properties that lived along the route, mostly people who needed housing of one type or another, and they weren't moved anywhere and they weren't replaced. So that was at the beginning, before anybody talked about a housing crisis, virtually never part of Canada. The LRT was responsible for being part of that trend.
And so, the LRT in Eglinton Crosstown still doesn't have an opening date. 4 years after it was supposed to be opened.
And then again, there's another great example of they're now talking about a potential date. And it's like, for whatever's said on that one, I don't understand how anybody who's in charge of the process is getting paid bonuses for a project that is well behind any kind of reasonable date. And to be fair, not being held accountable by the government that could fire him tomorrow.
We're chatting today with John Mykytyshyn. He's a political consultant, an operative, a pollster. He knows politics real well. We're going to chat about provincial, municipal, and federal politics and do a little bit of an update today. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes with John Mykytyshyn. Welcome back, everyone, to the Briancrombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. My guest tonight is John Mykytyshyn. He is a political consultant, an operative, a pollster, a very smart guy. He runs seminars for people on how to be a better campaign worker. He does assessments of what went wrong in campaigns and what went right. And he knows, I think, really intimately what's going on. John, let's talk about housing affordability. You touched on that in regards to the LRT. Premier Ford has come out with Bill 109, Bill 23. He had this big housing affordability task force a year ago that had something like 57 recommendations, but yet it doesn't look like anything's getting better. Nothing seems to be, moving strongly in terms of more housing affordability. Is he doing the right stuff? Is it resonating with the people? Are we going to get impatient with a lack of results if we don't have any results?
Well, let me take that in reverse order. Impatient. I think everybody's already impatient. I think everybody's already concerned. And I think it's a race for who's more impatient between children who are still living, adult children that are still living at home long after they thought they would be out on their own, and parents who would have thought their children would be out a long time before that as well. Certainly, I think the latest number I saw was 90% of the young people believe they'll never be able to own a home. And I don't think that'll be a reality in time. The problem is it's the perception now. So that's the perception, that's the feeling. It's giving people more angst than they need. And so what's the solution? And the short answer is only one thing. There really is only one answer, and the answer is more homes. So that's when you get into the other level of governments. So certainly the Premier has now passed some legislation, taken some actions, but the question of whether or not it was the right thing to do and whether or not it's effective takes time. So let me give you two examples of two municipalities that I know a little something about. One is Brampton and the other is Hamilton. So I live in Hamilton, and what I can tell you is to get something built here in Hamilton, it takes 8 to 12 years.
8 to 12 years.
8 to 12 years, which is mind-boggling. We've got parcels of land that have been waiting to be developed. Like we're talking about where they've ripped down the buildings and the lots have sat empty for years, and there's still no building going on. And conversely, I believe I attended the inaugural session or the swearing in of the new council in Brampton because I had the good fortune to be the campaign manager for the incumbent mayor and the re-elected mayor, Patrick Brown. And I was astonished. I wasn't even aware until that night, frankly, that the average build time in Brampton is 12 to 16 months. So clearly there's a difference.
Takes 4 times as long, 3 times to 4 times as long to get it approved, you're saying, than it actually does to build it.
The only thing that matters is some place for people to move into that's been well built. So what are the barriers to that? Now, certainly the Premier identified that there's problems at the municipal levels, and he brought in legislation. But if people choose not to use it, or their bureaucrats are just as effective at not being effective before the legislation or after the legislation as before, then nothing actually happens. And the reality is, if you and I went out tomorrow, had the land, had the approval, it takes time to build things. You have to get the workers, you have to get the materials, you have to get the funding all lined up. So there's a lot of moving pieces, but we have an industry that is often maligned, and like every profession, there are people that are the cause for the maligning. There's a bad apple on every barrel. But I'm speaking about the development industry now. There are many, many, many predominantly excellent people that are in that industry with one desire. They want to make things, they want to build things, they want to make homes, they want to make schools. The process for building institutions is a lot easier than building for homes, which is kind of crazy. So if you have all of these people, an entire industry that wants to build, what are the levers that get in the way of that? And the number one lever has been municipalities that get in the way.
Okay, so what do? Bill 109 was supposed to make it shorter, shorten the approval times. The leader of the New Democratic Party and I think the leader of the Conservative Party federally want to, give incentives or disincentives to municipalities that move fast or slow. It seems like, the municipal politicians and the planning departments have been the biggest blockage to supply, to increase supply. How do you make that change?
Absolutely, and I think that's where Pierre Poilievre has got the right approach, because he doesn't have one approach, right? He, for example, is someone who talks about, there's some real, you would think, easy, no-brainer things like you have a transit line. Well, everything with a certain amount of space from that transit line ought to be dedicated to fast, big builds. But undercutting or underpinning his whole approach is that there's both. There's carrot and a stick. So if you're, what levers does the federal government have? Well, one of them is money, right? I mean, we all know that the governments love money, but Pierre has said that if you build, we will incentivize you, we will give you more money, we will reward you. And conversely, if you're not, for whatever reason, because the municipality is in charge of running itself, but then they shouldn't be rewarded with federal funds in any kind whatsoever. So you could go back to Hamilton as an example and say there's significant federal funds that have been allocated for the LRT. Well, those funds could be pulled if you looked at Hamilton's completely shameful record of building.
Shameful record of building. You really think that the record of building in different municipalities is shameful? But they're influenced by their electorates, by their constituents, by the people that come out to the community planning sessions. They're not doing it just because they think that it's the right thing to do, are they? They're doing it because they're being influenced by their electorates on what to do.
Look, all electorates are pretty keen on two things. Nobody wants anything built in their own backyard, and everybody wants governments to do better. Right. So that doesn't really matter what the municipality is, but that's where you can look from municipality to municipality. What is the difference in things being achieved? You can look at in between, Mississauga has a good record of building. Brampton's got a good record of building. Halton, Oakville, Burlington, they all build. You get to Hamilton and like nothing's been built. You look at the census. Hamilton's a fair size of city, right? It's got a good footprint. There's room, and whether you thought it was a good idea that the premier had opened up the green belt, which he's now taken back, or wanted infill from day one, there's a lot of places to build within Hamilton. But what is the fundamental difference between a Brampton and a Hamilton? And one city is wired for getting it done, growth today, and the other is stuck in some kind of I got to say, bureaucratic incompetence. And that's where I'm not sure at the city council.
I'm not sure if I actually agree with your description of some of the other municipalities, frankly. Premier Ford came out with this objective of the 1.5 million homes over the course of 10 years. He allocated it out amongst different municipalities. And based on that number, Mississauga, Oakville, Brampton, et cetera, are building like 10% of what they would need to build. And so the building history of a lot of the 905 is dismal compared to what has to be achieved. And you've probably seen the numbers that have come out of CMHC. We are building in Southern Ontario today half on a per capita basis of what we were building in the 1970s. And it's interesting, single family homes are about the same, even though the population has increased dramatically. So one would think that we're still doing okay with single family homes, but we could be doing twice as much, frankly, if we could build on a per capita basis. Condos have gone up dramatically, primarily in Toronto. What's been decimated is rental housing. Rental housing has gone from a significant, 30 to 40% of the housing being built to less than 3%. What are we doing wrong with rental housing?
With rental housing, I think it's pretty straightforward. It's we have a landlord and tenant process which is lopsided. Landlords, there's two types of landlords, right? There's the fundamental big corporations that own hundreds and hundreds of units, and there's the mom and pop. So my dad, before he passed away, had worked his whole life and taken his money and slowly over time built up 10 houses, bought and purchased, didn't build them, but he bought them. And he rented them out to different people in town. And a couple of them he'd had that were rooming houses for individuals who could only afford a room versus an apartment or a house. But over the course of time, his experience with people got to be worse and worse. And we talked about perception of the 90% of young people who don't believe they'll ever own a home. I have to tell you that I'm willing to bet that the number, because I haven't seen one, but I'm willing to bet that the number is closer to 99% of those people that are small landlords, people who own 1 to 10 units or houses or condos, that they thought they would put their money into a place like that, and that would be their nest egg for the future. And what they're afraid of is they're totally afraid of bad tenants. And because we hear it all the time on the various radio stations, some expose of some person who decided to move in and then at some point in time decided not to pay rent anymore, and that it takes years to get rid of these people because there's a backlog at the tribunal still because of COVID, which is like, you would think that would be an easy thing. You would think that would be something that the premier by this point in time would have figured out to, if the backlog is it takes time, hire more people. Even if it's a short term, he doesn't have to hire them for a 30-year contract, but they should be getting those things, that backlog cleared. And there should be a better, I like bills of rights, right? As a person who takes planes on occasion, I think the airlines run better because there's a bill of rights if they fall into mistreating their customers. There's a pretty good system for tenants if they get a bad landlord, that they get brought into play. But there's virtually, even though they call it landlord and tenant board, there's virtually no repercussions if someone is a bad tenant, right? If WestJet does something foolish, we all hear about it and we talk about it for a week. If there's bad tenants that go from place to place, never paying rent, we never hear about those people.
What about rent controls?
Well, rent controls have shown to have worked where they work, and there's a reason why increasingly we don't build places that are subject to rent controls, because what they did is they stopped building anything that was governed by rent controls. So most people aren't even aware that there's two types of rental properties right now, right? There's the ones that were built that are subject to rent controls, and there's the properties that were built as rentals. But after a certain point, when the government said the only way we're going to get any building is to exempt builds moving forward. So,
but I hear that a lot of developers are concerned that, a new government might change that and put in rent controls again. And so one of the reasons why they're not building is they've seen what rent controls did the first time, or the second or third time, frankly, and think that it might happen again, which is not an illogical concern.
No, it's a very valid concern. And, I'm going to say something maybe a little controversial. The premier, I was saying to someone, how can Doug Ford get reelected? And I went, the premier may be the first politician who'll be able to not have his opponent say, elect me and I'll reverse what Doug Ford did, because the premier may have actually reversed everything he's already done. So it'll be an interesting election next time around. But the reality is, you can't expect one government to be held necessarily by the next one. And it's even worse when you have governments to backtrack on their own legislation or their own policies. So from somebody who has to interact with government, those fears are more than reasonable. And that's why if you had money and you wanted a safe bet, what you would do is build something that you can sell, that you have nothing to do with in the future.
In the last Toronto mayoralty election, we heard about problems with the Science Centre, that Ford wanted to close it, move it down to the waterfront, and real complaints about Ontario Place and the building of this new spa. What do you think is going to happen there? Is Ford just going to, work through it and ensure that those constructions and not listen to those concerns, or are people forgotten about those issues?
So a couple things. Again, the people who have those concerns will be the same people who have concerns who never want anything except what they want built down there, which is basically more free parkland. But there's a reality, right? That as kids, I think we all went to Ontario Place at least once a year. It was a fun place to be. And, the Liberal government that we had some time ago, facing the fact that it was no longer as fun for as many people and it was losing money every year, said this is kind of stupid. So let's stop creating more debt every year. Let's stop and figure out what the right thing is to move forward. And that's where you have a problem, right? It's look, you can look at any apartment building, any condo building, any subdivision where the homes look exactly the same, and you'd be amazed at how different they are in each and every unit from each other. And the reason for that is people are very different. And you look at the C&E grounds, you look at Ontario Place. What I've been fascinated, and I understand the people who have a concern about a private interest participating in any kind of contract, especially with something like a 99-year contract. I don't think anybody has actually explained why that's a good idea or why that little piece of the puzzle should move forward. 10-year contract, 20-year, 30-year contract, but a 99-year contract, I really don't see where that's defendable. And but aside from that, right on, I went to the Canadian National Exhibition with one of my kids, which is what we like to do once a year, another great Canadian tradition. And the reality is, I looked up from that beautiful convention center that we built, right? And it's a massive, beautiful place, but it doesn't get used as often as it should. And the number one reason is there isn't hotel rooms. Well, a few years ago, Toronto Council, the C&E board said, you know what, we're going to let somebody build a hotel on the C&E property. And guess what? There's this big hotel on the C&E property. That's not run by the city. It's not run by the C&E. It's a private enterprise. And it's there and it's operating. And, I've never been into the building, but it looks very nice from the outside. And there's a lot of rooms in that place.
It's a gorgeous building, and it's got a great rooftop patio.
Well, so explain to me, what's the difference between that and any kind of private spa or anything else that would be run at Ontario Place?
I think the difference is that the hotel is a very small amount of the exhibition lands. It's an excellent amenity, as you said. It's very helpful to attracting trade shows into the trade show building. I think the problem with the spa is it takes the vast majority of one of the islands. It's got this massive parking garage that's going to be built at provincial expense. It reduces dramatically the parkland, and the whole idea of Ontario Place was a place where Ontarians could go and experience sort of our land. And it was sort of built out to look like not just Southern Ontario, but Northern Ontario with the flume ride and other things. This is going to be an indoor spa, a massive indoor spa, built and owned by some people from Europe. That doesn't seem to have a lot to do with Ontario. It sounds like a great thing to have, maybe attached to some regional mall somewhere in a parking lot, but taking over an island at Ontario Place and representing what Ontario was all about, it just seems completely inconsistent. Anyway, we got to take a break. We're going to be back in 2 minutes with John Mykytyshyn, and we're going to turn to federal politics, see what he's got to say about Pierre Poilievre versus Justin Trudeau. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. It's a fun time for me to be chatting with and arguing a little bit with John Mykytyshyn, who is a political consultant. He's a pollster. He's a conservative activist. He's been involved in campaign after campaign, a couple of them that he was on the other side for me. And so that was one of the reasons why I've got such incredible respect for this gentleman. John, let's shift to federal politics. We've been chatting about provincial. Let's talk about Pierre Poilievre versus Justin Trudeau. Is Justin Trudeau going to take a walk in the snow? Is he going to resign? Should he resign? Is Pierre Poilievre going to win no matter what? Tell me what your assessment is.
I think in many ways, our current prime minister is walking the path of our former prime minister, and many of them, frankly. Just like Harper, I believe today, it's a problem when Canadians kind of adopted the presidential system of politics. So there are many, many good people in each political party and each caucus, but the vast weight is placed on the leader. And when you have a leader-based system, they become your best asset. And when things go south, when they go bad, when they start to smell like a week-old milk that was left out on the counter, you've got a problem. And just like Harper was the best asset that the party had. And there's a loyalty to each of the leaders. And we'll go back further to, for those of your listeners and viewers that might remember Brian Mulroney. Brian Mulroney held on to the point where he thought it was time for him to go and he was going to leave. But when a leader leaves, the problem is that they have personal relationships with caucus members, with cabinet ministers, with a good chunk of the party's infrastructure. And there are people who are supportive of what they've done in office. And that's where the prime minister is right now. Trudeau's problem now, aside from all of his policies and scandals, is the fact that he is the brand. So he's still got an opportunity to turn things around. He's still got ample opportunity to demonize Pierre and the other political leaders. Let's not forget that in the last two elections, he was behind, not expected to win. The Conservatives were in play to win both of the last elections, and it was the campaign itself. Brian, as you know, campaigns matter. And what happened in both of those situations were the Conservatives, something happened during the campaign that they weren't prepared to deal with effectively. They stumbled, they fell. The Liberals rallied. And that's why we've got the prime minister that we have today since 2015, because when an election came, he earned the right.
So if he's a good campaigner, if he's a good campaigner and the brand is more the Justin Trudeau party than it is the Liberal Party of old, should he just stick around and campaign again?
So go back to the Mulroney example, right? So Brian Mulroney leaves. There's a new person brought in to replace him. And at the end of the day, Kim Campbell, that campaign for a variety of reasons collapses and the party is reduced to 2 seats. I have to tell you, if I was a betting man, which I don't because I have terrible luck, the reality is that I believe fully that in the next election, if Trudeau retired, they would do less in seats than if he stays. So to me, he's their biggest hindrance. He's their biggest albatross, but he's also their biggest asset. So for the Liberal Party, I think, it's best for them to stay. And that's joyful for all the other political parties because he's the biggest, best target they all have to say that they want to be an alternative to, as opposed to somebody brand new.
I think you were at the recent Conservative convention. I watched the speeches. Pierre Poilievre and several other speakers really catered to the trucker convoy. They mentioned truckers on several occasions. They mentioned freedom on several occasions. Is this a party that has been taken over by people that were part of that trucker convoy, the freedom convoy, or are they just sort of appealing to those voters, not wanting to alienate them and having them go back to the PCP? Or tell me what the attitude is there.
I don't think it's as prominent in any way whatsoever that you might be seeing. I think by and large, the Conservative Party is the party that believes the most in freedom. It believes the most in individual liberty. It would be the party that would be seen as the one that would be most in favor of, for example, land rights. We really don't have land rights in Canada. But despite the fact that the greatest quote around personal liberty in the bedroom came from a Liberal prime minister, I think actually Conservatives are the party that believe the most that you should do what you want at home, in your own bedroom, in your own house, in your own school, in your own workplace, respecting the rights of others and working with people.
We got two Conservative premiers, at least one Conservative premier and a Saskatchewan party premier, that are really restricting people's rights or trying to in regards to sexual orientation and their pronouns and stuff like that. Is that freedom, or is that government having regulation to control who we think we are?
Or is it elected officials understanding the system and going with what the views are of 80% of the people? And that's where we get some interesting and delicate and problematic intersections, right? If people allow themselves to be put on either side of a debate that says, I'm for gender rights, I'm for parental rights, and they're mutually exclusive, then there's a problem, because our country is formulated and been successful for the most part because it is a multicultural country where people of many different views and perspectives, often with relationship to how they view each other has been successful in accommodating. And I have to tell you, as a young kid, one of the first books I read was about the Black Donnellys, a very famous family from southwestern Ontario. And it wasn't until I went a couple of years ago to see a play about that book with my daughter in London, Ontario, that I understood the roots of this conflict with this family and the community. And it was all about religious persecution between different sects within the Christian community that emanated back to England. So, there's our history as humanity has been fraught with divisions almost for the sake of division, as opposed to how do we work things out. And in this era where we're moving more towards truth and reconciliation, not just with our Indigenous peoples, but that spirit should be taken further and further. And I'll go back to that Brampton swearing in ceremony again, where it was the first time I heard, I don't remember the chief's name, but somebody came and brought the land acknowledgement. And part of what she said that night was their philosophy as a people was not about the problem, number one problem in politics. It's about 4 years or less, right? What can a government do to get credit for to move forward? Whereas our Indigenous peoples are premised on 7 generations, right? That long-term thinking of what will this policy have? What is the impact going to be? Not today, not tomorrow, not to get reelected in 4 years, but generations from now. And that's one of the, I think, greatest contributions that can be made to our country and our community if we were to try to bring more of that thinking in a spirit of reconciliation for all of our differences.
What do you think of Poilievre? How's he doing so far?
I think he's doing great so far. I did not support him for the leadership. I supported someone else. And at the end of the day, since he got elected, I think he has proven that he's a tireless worker. He's dedicated to the job. He's willing to tell you what he thinks. There used to be a game that said if the numbers are on your side, go hide. You might say something to offend somebody and lose your lead. But he's out there quite clearly coming up with policy that he doesn't need to, right? He could just wait for Trudeau to fall. But on the housing example, he's done videos. He's very clear, got an idea of how to try to help the municipalities be motivated to do things. And across the board, he's got a good caucus behind him. He's got a lot of talent. For him to become prime minister, he needs many more people to be elected. And they're just in that phase now where they're recruiting people. We're about to have a whole lot of nomination meetings across the country. And talent is lining up to serve in a PR government. And that wouldn't be happening if he didn't resonate both with voters, but also with the people who want to serve in his government.
There was a lot of people that thought that he was going to be too right wing, appealed to the social conservatives too much. Jean Charest ran a campaign that was far more attractive to red Tories. There's now a political party that's thinking about launching that's going to be blue Liberals, red Tories, et cetera, because they say that Poilievre is way to the right. What do you think? Is he way to the right, or is he going to be like Stephen Harper, Brian Mulroney?
I think he'd be a prudent prime minister for Canada. Certainly, every party has its, it's got its body, but it's also got its wings. It's got its reasonable people, and it's got its people that want things their way. And I think he's certainly a strong enough leader, because that's been a problem from time to time as well. He's a strong enough leader in the Harper mold who knows what he believes and is willing to be open-minded and work with people and give them space to be heard and to persuade him. But at the end of the day, he knows the policy he wants. He knows the road he's going to walk down. And I think he's going to be able to keep people unified increasingly behind the big pictures, right? Like, what are the first 10 things we need to do as a government, not the first 100 things? Because it's further down the list you go is where you find more division. Right. So right now, all Conservatives are united on getting rid of Trudeau. So that's step one. Step two, probably our monetary policy, followed closely by housing. So he's doing a great job. And I think you'll see the fruits of his time since getting elected only last year, that you'll see the fruits of that in the upcoming nomination cycle.
So, John Mykytyshyn, thank you very much for sharing your thoughts of the current political environment with us. Let me ask you one last question. Who do you think, after the next election cycle, is going to be the Premier of Ontario, the Prime Minister of Canada, and what the heck, maybe the Mayor of Toronto or the Mayor of Hamilton?
Okay, so Hamilton, absolutely no idea. There was a big turnover in councillors. I was a proponent of Andrea for years that she should lead the provincial scene and be the mayor of Hamilton. She's been basically absent, certainly the lowest profile mayor we've had. So I think that's an open question because again, but she is a name and she had a tight election. It requires a big challenger. Premier again is interesting. This would be Doug Ford's third election. I can tell you 2 months ago, I said he was a lock before this Greenbelt issue blew up the way that it did and with the reports that have been filed. But I believe that if the Premier settled things down, focused on getting his agenda through, and thought of one or two key other policies that he could bring in, because getting the number of houses built in the time frame he'd like isn't going to happen, right? But it's good to have, as a former premier would have said once upon a time, stretch goals are a good thing. Goals in general are a good thing, but reality on the street, making people happy, is better. So I think if Doug Ford runs for re-election, which I believe he will, that he will win, although I'm certain that the new Liberal leader is going to give him a run for his money. I've been a little disappointed in the NDP leader, so I think that's very much in the mix. But I think Ford is, even with the term he's had, is on track to get elected for the third time with the majority. And then, as far as national politics, I think Pierre Poilievre is about to be our next prime minister, solidly.
John Mykytyshyn, thanks so much. We're going to take a break for some messages, and I'm going to come back with my own point of view just after the break. Stay with us, everyone. John, really appreciate it.
My pleasure.